All right, let's dive into something I know you've been wanting to explore more deeply.
Okay.
Switzerland's 2025 ESG reforms. Um, we're talking mandatory climate reports for companies.
Wow.
We're talking net zero roadmaps, expanded emissions disclosures, like
Get
every,
the whole nine
yeah,
yards.
and how this is going to shake things up for companies and investors, and really the future of sustainable finance globally.
Absolutely. What I think is some interesting here is that Switzerland's really not, gently pushing people towards sustainability. It's
Right.
like a full-on cannonball into the deep end. I mean, it's pretty bold.
Yeah, okay, so let's take a look at this. Let's start with Switzerland's Climate and Innovation Act, or as they call it, CIA.
Right.
And this isn't just a suggestion. It legally binds Switzerland to net zero emissions by 2050.
Yeah.
And get this, it applies to almost every single company in the country,
Mm-hmm.
except for agriculture.
That's right.
So,
And this is where it gets interesting.
okay,
The CIA isn't just about like setting a target. It's about creating a super detailed roadmap to actually, get there.
right.
So companies now need to come up with sector-specific plans that have very clear reduction targets, like no more vague promises.
Yeah,
This is putting teeth into their net zero goals.
yeah. And it doesn't stop there. Financial institutions are also, like, really feeling the pressure from this too, right?
Absolutely. I mean, they're now facing increased scrutiny to make sure that their entire investment portfolios are aligned with these climate objectives.
Yeah.
This is huge for the financial sector.
Yeah, definitely. So we have companies trying to figure out like how to get to net zero.
Yeah.
And then you add on this revised ordinance on climate disclosures,
Mm-hmm.
which adds, even more complexity.
Indeed. And the scope of this ordinance is huge.
Yeah.
The threshold for the companies that need to be the parking has been lowered so much that it's brought in something like 3,500 companies under these new rules,
Wow.
which is 10 times more than before.
Okay, so that's a lot more companies. What exactly are they required to report on?
Well, one of the most significant changes is the move towards what's called full scope 1 to 3 emissions reporting.
Okay, so for our listeners that don't know, break down what Scope 3 emissions even are.
Right. So imagine a clothing company. Scope 1 covers the emissions from their own factories and offices, right?
Yeah?
Scope 2 includes the emissions from the energy that they buy to power those places. But Scope 3, this is the big one.
Okay.
This covers all of the indirect emissions that happen in the entire value chain.
Oh, wow.
So for the clothing company, we're talking about everything from the emissions from the production of the raw materials, like the cotton,
Oh, okay.
to transportation,
Mm-hmm.
to the energy that's used by customers when they wash their clothes,
Wow.
even the emissions from the eventual disposal of those clothes.
So it's truly like a holistic view
Exactly.
of the company's impact.
Exactly. So forcing companies to consider Scope 3 is huge.
Yeah,
And it makes them think beyond just their immediate operations
right,
and consider what their suppliers are doing
right.
and even their customers are doing.
Wow.
And it's not just about reporting the numbers, it's also about having actual plans to reduce these emissions.
Okay.
So there's a phased approach for the Scope 3 reporting
Mm-hmm.
that will end in full disclosure by 2027.
Oh, wow. So it seems like kind of a logistical nightmare, right?
Yeah.
For companies.
Some companies, for sure.
But I guess like the idea is you can't manage what you don't measure.
Exactly. By making these hidden emissions, actually come to light, it incentivizes companies to make changes in their supply chains.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got these mandatory GHG inventories, which include Scope 3 emissions. What else is in these reporting requirements?
Well, they also need to make what are called transition plans, which are these detailed roadmaps for how they're actually going to achieve net zero.
Right.
And these plans need to be aligned with Switzerland's 2050 goal and include really specific, measurable milestones tailored to each specific sector.
Yeah, so I imagine that involves a lot of collaboration
Definitely.
and innovation,
Absolutely.
both within companies and across different industries, right?
Definitely. These transition plans are pushing companies to get creative about reducing their impact while also remaining competitive.
Yeah.
So we're seeing a lot of investment in new technologies and new business models.
So it's not just like we came up with a plan and put it in a drawer
Right.
and, forgot about it. There's like a digital compliance aspect to this as well, right?
That's another crucial point. These reports aren't just like documents anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Companies have to use a very specific machine-readable format
Wow.
that are compatible with things like the EU's European Single Access Point, which is a platform.
Okay.
So this shift towards this data-driven ESG reporting
Yeah.
allows for much more sophisticated analysis and benchmarking, both for regulators and investors.
So with all of these new requirements, like it's kind of natural to be like, okay, why now?
Mm-hmm.
What's the urgency?
Yeah.
Like, why is Switzerland pushing these through?
Well, I think there's a few key factors.
Okay,
So first, these reforms are a direct response to those net zero targets that are set by the Climate and Innovation Act.
right.
Switzerland is really serious about meeting their climate commitments,
Okay.
and they see these reporting requirements as like essential.
Okay, but Switzerland's, already kind of known for being pretty environmentally conscious.
That's true.
So is there something more than just, them trying to hit their targets?
Well, remember those referendums
Oh,
on
yeah.
environmental policies that happened back in 2023?
Mm-hmm.
Those votes show that people really want stronger climate action.
Right.
Citizens are really concerned about the impacts of climate change.
Yeah.
And they're pushing the government and businesses to actually do something about it.
So it's not just about meeting, like, their own targets. It's about, like, what their citizens are demanding.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget about the European Union, right?
Right.
They have a very close relationship.
Right.
So being aligned on regulations is important for smooth trade and cooperation.
Right.
And with the EU coming out with all their ESG regulations, like the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive or CSRD,
Mm-hmm.
Swiss firms are feeling the pressure to keep up.
Right. So can you break down what the CSRD does?
Sure. So it basically expands the scope of sustainability reporting requirements
Okay.
for EU companies, covering all kinds of things from environmental impact to social responsibility to corporate governance.
Right.
So the goal is to create a level playing field
Okay.
so that companies are really accountable for their sustainability performance.
So Switzerland's trying to keep pace with the EU so that their businesses aren't at a disadvantage.
Precisely. And there's another EU regulation we should mention.
Okay.
The Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is. It's still being finalized.
Okay.
But it's going to require companies to look at, prevent, and mitigate any negative impacts on human rights and the environment
Wow.
throughout their entire value chain.
That sounds like a lot.
It is, but it shows that sustainability is no longer like a nice thing to do.
Right.
It's essential for responsible businesses.
Yeah.
And Switzerland is on board with that philosophy.
So we've talked about, government mandates. We've talked about pressure from the EU.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also another, like, really big player here, and that's investors.
Absolutely. And investing has fundamentally changed.
Mm-hmm.
Investors want more transparency from the companies they invest in.
Yeah.
And they're putting their money where their mouth is, We're seeing this huge shift towards what's called ESG-focused investing,
Right.
where investors are prioritizing companies with strong environmental, social, and governance performance.
It's not just about, like, feeling good. It's about making smart investments.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Investors are realizing that ignoring ESG is no longer an option because companies that have bad ESG performance are higher risk
Yeah.
from both a reputational and a financial standpoint.
So these regulations are really giving those investors the information they need
Yeah,
to make better decisions.
that's a big goal, yeah. These standardized disclosures help investors compare companies across different sectors,
Right.
different geographies, and they can actually tell who the leaders and the laggards are.
So it seems like consumers are also way more aware of this stuff.
Definitely.
And, companies are realizing if they don't pay attention to ESG, it's bad for business.
Yeah. People are understanding that sustainability is not just about, like, doing good.
Right.
It's about creating long-term value.
So it seems like everybody's kind of on the same page, right?
Mm.
Like governments, the EU, investors, consumers, all pushing in the same direction.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of momentum. It's
Yeah.
interesting to watch.
Yeah, it really is. So we've talked about what these reforms are, why they're happening.
Mm-hmm.
Now let's get down to, the impact.
Yeah.
What does this mean for companies, especially, those small and medium enterprises?
Yeah, good question.
We'll tackle all that right after this.
For a lot of companies, especially like small and medium enterprises,
Mhm.
These new regulations can feel like overwhelming.
Yeah, you mentioned the costs before the break. Like, how much are we really talking about here?
Yeah, so think about everything involved. Like, you have to get all this data, you have to get it audited, you might even have to restructure your supply chains just to meet all these standards. So it really adds up. And quickly,
Yeah.
some estimates say it could be a 15–20% increase in operating costs for smaller companies.
Oof. That's a lot. especially for companies that are already operating like on tight margins.
It is, and it's not just like the immediate costs.
Right.
It's also figuring out this, complex regulatory landscape that keeps
Hmm.
changing.
Yeah.
A lot of small and medium businesses, they just don't have the in-house expertise to handle it all.
Right.
So they end up having to pay for consultants or legal advice.
Right. So not just a financial strain, but like a strain on their resources and time.
Exactly. And even for bigger companies, just
Yeah.
like changing their whole reporting system to meet these new digital requirements, it's a huge deal.
Right.
They're like investing in new technologies. They're hiring new staff. They're completely rethinking how they're approaching sustainability.
Okay. So we talked a little about the supply chains before. How are these reforms impacting the relationship that companies have with their suppliers?
Yeah, so it's like a domino effect
Okay.
because, with the Scope 3 reporting,
Yeah?
they're having to like really look at the environmental and social practices of their suppliers no matter where they are.
Oh, wow.
So they're doing audits, they're requiring suppliers to change how they do things. Some of them are even ending relationships with suppliers who aren't meeting the standards.
So this is like truly a global change.
It is, and we're seeing this like across a bunch of different industries.
Okay.
For example, in the textile industry,
Yep.
Swiss brands are like demanding transparency from the cotton suppliers in like India and Bangladesh.
Yeah.
They want them to use organic farming, they want better working conditions, stricter environmental controls, all this stuff.
That's so interesting. Like a regulation in Switzerland impacting, farms in India.
Yeah, it shows how connected our economy is,
Yeah.
and it's creating a lot of challenges for some of these suppliers,
Yeah.
but it's also an opportunity for the suppliers who are ready to like adapt.
Okay, so we've talked about the challenges for companies,
Hmm.
but what about the investors?
Yeah.
Like, what are the benefits for them? How are these reforms creating, new opportunities in the financial world?
I mean, one of the biggest advantages for investors is that they can do much better due diligence.
Okay.
Because there's all this ESG data now.
Yeah.
They can actually really analyze a company's sustainability performance.
Right.
They can look at everything from a company's transition plan to their actual emissions.
It's like they have like a better lens.
Exactly.
So you see the risk and opportunity.
Yeah, they're not just relying on financial statements like
Right.
they used to. They're
Yeah.
actually digging deep
Yeah.
into a company's, ESG performance to see how sustainable and resilient it really is.
So you mentioned risk. A lot of investors are really concerned about like stranded assets,
Mm-hmm.
especially in high emission industries.
Yeah, for sure.
How do these regulations play into that?
So aligning portfolios with Swiss standards is a good way to like avoid those stranded assets because,
Okay.
if you're investing in a coal-fired power plant, for example,
Right.
you could end up losing a lot of money.
Okay, so for listeners that don't know,
Yeah.
what do we even mean by stranded assets?
Right. So stranded asset is basically anything like, let's say, a power plant or an oil pipeline.
Okay.
That loses its value because of things like regulations and, new technologies or like changing markets.
Okay.
So
So investors are like afraid of putting money into things that are suddenly going to become worthless
exactly.
in a low carbon future.
And that's why these reforms are good. They're
Yeah.
forcing companies to think about this
Right.
and come up with plans for the future.
So it seems like investors are now thinking more long term
Mm-hmm.
when they're thinking about where to put their money.
Definitely. And it's fueling something we call impact investing.
Okay, break down impact investing for me.
So impact investing is about getting financial returns,
Okay.
but also having a positive social and environmental impact.
Okay.
So we're seeing a lot of interest in things like green bonds,
Mm-hmm.
ESG compliant funds,
Okay.
just investments that care about making money and doing good things.
Yeah, so you can like align your values with your investments
Exactly.
and, still make money.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like Switzerland's becoming like a center for that kind of thing.
Definitely, because these regulations make things more transparent, which is what investors want.
So it's not just about making the most money anymore. It's
Right.
about, making money the right way.
Yeah, there's a bigger picture now.
Yeah. So Switzerland's, this leader in global finance. Do you think these ESG reforms will like have a ripple effect?
It's a good question. A lot of experts are watching closely. Switzerland's trying to line up with these ISSB and ESRS standards,
Okay.
which are global frameworks for reporting.
Okay.
So it definitely sets a good example.
Okay. For our listeners, what are those? What are the ISSB and ESRS standards?
Right. So the ISSB is called the International Sustainability Standards Board.
Okay.
They're working on a global baseline for sustainability disclosures.
Okay.
So they'll help investors better understand the risks and opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And then ESRS, that's the European Sustainability Reporting Standards.
Okay.
And that's a bunch of rules that are part of that CSRD we talked about
Okay.
earlier. They cover like a lot of different ESG topics,
hmm
and the goal is to make sure that companies are giving, comparable information.
So Switzerland aligning with these global standards shows they're serious
Definitely.
about setting a high bar.
Yeah. And it could mean other countries do the same thing
hmm
because, investors want to be able to compare companies
Right.
across different markets, and companies don't want to have to follow a million different rules.
Yeah, I mean, a unified approach makes a lot more sense.
Definitely.
But there's kind of like a rivalry between Switzerland and the EU, right?
Yeah, that's an important point. So while Switzerland's narrowed the gap with the EU,
Mm.
there are still some differences.
Right.
Some places in the EU, like Luxembourg and Ireland, have lower compliance burdens,
No, okay.
historically.
So it's not like if Switzerland does it, every company in the world has to follow the same thing.
Right. Companies need to be smart about how they do this.
Right. They need to be like adaptable.
Yeah, they need to think local and international.
We've talked about, developed countries, but what about emerging markets? How are these reforms impacting them?
So that's a really important thing to think about. These reforms are putting a lot of pressure on suppliers in countries that don't have very developed regulations
hmm
because they have to meet Switzerland's standards if they want to keep working with them.
So Switzerland's like inadvertently raising the bar.
Exactly. And it could be good. Like it could
Okay.
push these suppliers to be more sustainable,
Yeah.
improve working conditions, reduce pollution, things like that.
Yeah, that's
But
right.
some suppliers, especially small ones, might not be able to keep up.
Right.
They could get pried out.
Yeah.
And that could make things worse for developing countries.
So it's like a delicate balance
It
between
is.
doing good
Hmm.
and making sure developing countries aren't left behind.
Exactly. It's complicated,
Yeah.
but it's a conversation we need to have.
hmm
It shows that we need to work together, and support these developing countries.
Okay. We've talked about the impact on companies, investors, global supply chains. What about technology? How does that fit into all of this?
Oh, technology is huge.
Yeah.
I mean, we wouldn't be able to transition to a sustainable future without it.
Okay.
We're seeing all this new stuff like blockchain for tracking emissions,
Okay.
artificial intelligence for like analyzing ESG risks, satellite imagery for like keeping an eye on deforestation.
Wow.
I mean, we're getting so much more transparent.
Yeah.
It's easier for companies to see their impact, investors to like look at their portfolios,
Yeah.
regulators to make sure everyone's doing what they're supposed for.
It seems like technology is really empowering everyone
Definitely.
to make good decisions.
Yeah, it's exciting.
It's really cool to see how everything's connected.
Mm-hmm.
Like these regulations aren't just impacting one company, they're impacting whole systems.
Yeah, and we're just getting started, I think.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like this is like the beginning of a bigger change.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, that's a great place to pause. We'll be back after a quick message to wrap up this deep dive into Switzerland's ESG reforms. All right, we're back. Let's wrap up our deep dive into Switzerland's 2025 ESG reforms. We talked about like a lot of stuff,
Yeah.
from mandatory climate reports to the impact on global supply chains, even impact investing. It's been like a really interesting conversation.
It has. It's really fascinating to see how these regulations are changing everything.
Yeah. So let's do like a quick recap for our listeners. We started by looking at how Switzerland is really focused on hitting net zero emissions by 2050.
Right.
And, they're not just talking about it. They've got this Climate and Innovation Act, the CIA, that's making companies actually do it. And then there's the Ordinance on Climate Disclosures, which makes companies report on all their emissions, right?
Exactly. And those reporting requirements are really something else. I mean, thousands of companies now have to show all their emissions, including Scope 3, which is like everything they do.
Right, the whole value chain.
Yeah. Plus, they need those transition plans.
Right, those roadmaps.
Yeah. And it's not just about writing it down somewhere. It has to be digital so everyone can see it.
Right, super transparent. So these reforms are happening partly because of Switzerland's own climate goals, but also because the EU is doing similar things. Like they've got the CSRD and the CSDDD, which are putting pressure on Swiss companies to keep up.
Yeah. They don't want to fall behind.
And of course, we can't forget about the investors.
Right.
They're like a big part of this whole thing.
Definitely.
Investors want companies to be transparent about how they're doing on ESG.
Yeah. They're putting their money where their values are.
And we talked about how these reforms can be like a challenge for companies, especially smaller ones, but there are also opportunities, especially for investors who are interested in, impact investing.
Exactly. It's not just about avoiding risk. It's about doing good and making money at the same time.
Yeah. And, it's interesting how these regulations are impacting global supply chains. Swiss companies are now expecting their suppliers all over the world to be more sustainable.
Right. It's raising the bar for everyone.
Yeah, and we can't forget about technology's role in all of this.
Definitely. Technology is making everything more transparent and accountable.
So, the big question is, are other countries going to do what Switzerland's doing?
That's the big question.
Will this be the start of a global shift toward tougher ESG rules?
It's hard to say. Switzerland's setting a good example, and they're using those global standards, the ISSB and ESRS.
Right.
But it depends on, political will and how much pressure there is from the public and investors.
So it's still kind of up in the air.
Yeah, but one thing's for sure.
Yeah.
ESG isn't just some niche topic anymore.
Right. It's a big deal.
Yeah, it's something everyone needs to pay attention to.
So to everyone listening, stay informed, stay engaged, and think about what you can do to contribute.
Exactly. Every decision matters.
Whether you're an investor, a business owner, or just a consumer, who cares?
Exactly.
And that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into Switzerland's ESG reforms. We'll be back next time with another interesting topic. Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.